Imagine being trapped inside a city. Stone walls surround you, with no way out. Outside, an army of 100,000 warriors circles every exit, blocking any chance of escape. Food is running low, water is scarce, people are eating anything they can find, rats, leather, whatever it takes to survive. But then, something happens that changes everything. The attacking army doesn't just want to conquer this city, they want to use it as a weapon, one that will destroy entire civilizations across continents. The year is 1346, the place is Kafa, wealthy trading port on the Black Sea, and what happens next will change the course of history forever. This is the insane story of how one decision during a siege led to the deaths of 200 million people across 3 continents. 200 million. That's more than the combined death tolls of World War I and World War II, and it all started with one horrifying idea. In 1346, Kafa was one of the most prosperous cities on the Black Sea, a major trading hub for merchants from Italy, Greece, and the East. The city was rich with goods, culture, and wealth, but its fate would soon take a dark turn. The Golden Horde, led by Janibeg, had already conquered vast swaths of territory, and now they had their sights set on Kafa. Janibeg, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, was no stranger to violence. His army had already destroyed countless cities and villages in their path. But Kafa was different. The leaders of Kafa, realizing the Mongol army was too powerful to resist, decided to surrender. They paid tribute and accepted Mongol governance, hoping that submission would spare their city from destruction. But Janibeg had other plans. He wasn't just after gold or territory, he wanted to send a message to the world. He wanted to make Kafa an example. For months, the Mongol army surrounded Kafa, cutting off all supplies and forcing the city into a brutal siege. The people inside starved, their hope dwindling with each passing day. But it wasn't the siege that would destroy Kafa, it was the decision Janibeg made when a mysterious disease began to spread through his camp. As the siege wore on, something unexpected happened. Janibeg's army, already ravaging the surrounding lands, began to succumb to a terrifying disease. Soldiers started falling ill by the thousands. Their bodies were covered in black swellings. Blood poured from their mouths. The plague had arrived. What was once a mighty, thriving army now looked like a dying mass of humanity. But Janibeg, instead of retreating or trying to save his soldiers, saw an opportunity. Instead of burning the bodies or isolating the infected, he came up with a plan so twisted it would change history forever. He decided to use the disease as a weapon, something no one had ever thought of before. He ordered his engineers to load the infected bodies of his soldiers into catapults. Not stones, not fire, but rotting, disease-ridden corpses. His plan was to launch these bodies over the city walls of Kafa. The horror that followed is almost impossible to imagine. Corpses, carrying the deadly plague bacteria, rained down on the city, infecting the defenders and the civilian population alike. Within days, the plague spread like wildfire. The people of Kafa, already weakened by starvation and thirst, stood no chance. The air filled with the stench of death as bodies piled up in the streets. The city had become a tomb. But the horror didn't end there. A few Genoese traders, desperate to escape, managed to board their ships and set sail, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. They didn't know they were carrying a silent, deadly passenger. The plague was on their ships, hidden within the fleas on the rats that infested their cargo holds. These ships, floating carriers of death, sailed across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. Their first stop was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. When they arrived, the plague disembarked with them. From Constantinople, it was a short journey to Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. Each port they visited became a new epicenter of the pandemic. Imagine the scene. A ship arrives, the crew either dead or dying, their bodies covered in the same black sores seen in Kafa. The authorities would try to turn the ships away, but it was too late. The rats and the fleas they carried had already scurried ashore. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. From these Italian ports, the plague exploded across the continent. It traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. No one was safe. It swept through France, Spain, England, and Germany, leaving a trail of devastation unlike anything seen before or since. Within 5 years, nearly half of Europe's population was gone. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became ghost towns. The social order collapsed. People abandoned their families. Priests refused to perform last rites, and the living were too few to bury the dead. The world was plunged into an age of darkness, fear, and paranoia, and it all started with one man's decision to turn disease into a weapon. Janibeg's act of biological warfare at the siege of Kafa was not just a military tactic. It was the spark that ignited one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The Genoese ships, fleeing one nightmare, inadvertently unleashed a far greater one upon the world. The Black Death reshaped society, economy, and religion. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and paved the way for the Renaissance. But it came at a staggering cost: 200 million lives. The story of Kafa is a chilling reminder of how a single brutal decision can have consequences that ripple across centuries and continents, forever altering the course of our shared history. It shows how interconnected our world has always been, and how quickly a localized disaster can become a global catastrophe. Thank you so much for watching. This story is a powerful piece of our past, and understanding it helps us understand the world we live in today. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most incredible stories. Let me know in the comments what you think about this event. Until next time, stay curious. As the bodies began to rain down on Kafa, the true horror of Janibeg's plan became apparent. The city's defenders watched in terror as the dead were hurled over their walls. These weren't just bodies, they were weapons. Their decomposed forms exploded on impact, spewing infected blood and pus into the air. A grotesque mist carried by the wind to every corner of the city. What had started as a siege now became a death sentence. Within days, the first signs appeared. A merchant here, a soldier there. Small outbreaks at first, but they spread with terrifying speed. The telltale black swellings appeared on their necks, armpits, and groins, followed by a raging fever, coughing up blood, and then, inevitably, death. The disease, Yersinia pestis, better known to history as the Black Death, had taken root in the heart of Kafa. The defenders tried to fight back. They desperately threw the catapulted corpses into the sea and burned the remains, but it was a futile effort. The damage was done. The bodies launched from the Mongol camp had delivered their deadly cargo, and there was no escaping its reach. As the days turned into weeks, more and more people fell ill. The Genoese defenders, who had believed their stone walls could withstand any Mongol assault, now faced an invisible, unstoppable enemy. They were trapped, surrounded by a killer they couldn't see and couldn't fight. Desperation turned to panic. Citizens tried to flee the city, hoping to outrun the invisible killer. But their escape only served to spread the plague further. In the dead of night, merchant ships slipped out of the besieged port, their crews desperate to leave Kafa behind. They had no idea they weren't escaping death, they were carrying it with them, unwittingly delivering the plague to every port they reached. Inside Kafa's walls, chaos reigned. A once proud and prosperous city was reduced to a landscape of fear and death. The disease moved faster than any army, sweeping through crowded streets and homes, claiming lives in mere hours. There was no cure, no defense. The sick would collapse, and their bodies were left in the streets, piling up in corners like refuse. Those with any strength left tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The surrounding lands were under Mongol control, and the sea, as it turned out, was no safer. As those merchant ships, desperate to escape the infected port, sailed for other shores, they carried death across the waves. Every city they docked in, from Constantinople to Venice, soon felt the plague's cold grasp. Within weeks, the disease had exploded out of Kafa and across Europe, devastating entire populations. The great cities along the Mediterranean coastline fell like dominoes. Constantinople, one of the richest and most powerful cities in the world, saw its population decimated. But the plague didn't stop there. It spread up the Italian peninsula, through France, and across the Channel to England, leaving a trail of death that claimed millions of lives. What Janibeg had started with a single, brutal decision to use his dead soldiers as a biological weapon had spiraled into a continent-sweeping pandemic. Historians now estimate that the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, wiping out a huge portion of Europe's population, and it can all be traced back to that one moment during the siege of Kafa, the launching of plague-ridden corpses into the heart of the city. Janibeg, in his quest to conquer a single city, had unwittingly unleashed one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. But there was a grim irony to his plan. The Mongol army itself was not immune. Soon, the disease that they had so callously weaponized turned on them. Janibeg's own troops began to fall sick. Thousands of his elite Mongol warriors died, weakening the once unstoppable Golden Horde from within. Janibeg's decision had backfired in a way he could never have imagined. What began as a calculated move to break Kafa had spiraled into a catastrophe beyond his control. His own army, the instrument of his power, began to collapse under the very disease it had spread. The soldiers who had launched death over the walls now became its victims. Reports from the Mongol camp were horrifying. Warriors who had marched proudly under Janibeg's banner were now falling by the thousands. Their bodies ravaged by the plague, corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Entire divisions were wiped out in a matter of days. The mighty Mongol army, which had conquered nations, was being destroyed by an enemy too small to see. In his obsessive pursuit of vengeance, Janibeg had completely ignored the risks of biological warfare. He had underestimated the power of a disease to spread uncontrollably. What was meant to be a strategic masterstroke to cripple Kafa's defenders was now consuming his own forces, weakening his army to the point where they could no longer sustain the siege. By the time the Mongols were finally forced to retreat, they had lost an estimated 85,000 men to the plague. Their once imposing strength was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The retreat wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound humiliation. Janibeg, the formidable conqueror, was now fighting for his own survival, not against enemy armies, but against the plague he had unleashed. The war he had hoped would cement his power had instead led to his empire's ruin. The Golden Horde, weakened by the plague and Janibeg's catastrophic miscalculation, would never fully recover. His conquest of Kafa had turned into a disaster of historical proportions, and the price was not just the loss of his men, but the complete devastation of his reputation and his legacy. Janibeg's retreat from Kafa marked the beginning of a swift and brutal end to his reign. The once mighty Golden Horde, a colossal power that had stretched across the vast plains of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, was now crumbling into ruins. The Mongol Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was on the verge of total collapse. It wasn't just weakened by a humiliating military failure, but by the very pandemic that had ravaged its own ranks. The weapon Janibeg had so callously hoped would crush his enemies had boomeranged, turning into the instrument of his own downfall. His campaign to conquer Kafa had started as a strategic mission, a calculated move to expand Mongol control over the lucrative Black Sea trade routes. But it had spiraled into a catastrophic disaster, one with consequences that would ripple far beyond the city walls. The plague didn't just stay contained within Kafa. As the Mongol army retreated in disarray, they carried the deadly pestilence with them, becoming unwitting agents of its spread throughout their own empire. From there, it was unstoppable. It hitched rides on trade caravans and ships, ravaging Europe, Asia, and North Africa, leaving behind a horrifying trail of death that would fundamentally reshape the world for centuries to come. The Golden Horde was never the same. It had once been a fearsome military machine, commanding the absolute loyalty of vast territories and countless peoples. But after the devastating losses at Kafa, it was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. Janibeg's grip on power, once absolute, began to loosen. Rival factions within the fractured Mongol Empire saw their chance and began to rise, each one hungry to claim control over the smoldering remnants of the Golden Horde. The empire splintered into smaller, warring khanates, and Janibeg's influence evaporated almost overnight. Even after his defeat, the dire consequences of his decision to use the plague as a weapon continued to haunt him. His once glorious reign, filled with conquest and ambition, was now forever marred by his catastrophic failure to comprehend the destructive power of the very biological warfare he had so arrogantly unleashed. His legacy became a stark cautionary tale, a warning not only of military overreach but of the terrifying dangers of tampering with forces far beyond human control. In the years that followed, Janibeg would become a figure of infamy. His ambition and his ruthlessness had once been his greatest strengths, the very qualities that propelled him to power. But in the end, they were also his undoing. As the Black Death continued its grim march across the globe, the world would never forget the man who had turned disease into a weapon and, in doing so, paid the ultimate price for his hubris. Janibeg's decline was not a swift, clean fall from grace. It was a slow, agonizing process. a painful erosion of power that saw his authority crumble bit by bit, like the ruins of a once mighty fortress slowly weathering away. The disastrous retreat from Kafa and the unimaginable devastation wrought by the plague had signaled the beginning of the end for the Golden Horde. But it wasn't until later that the full, horrifying consequences of Janibeg's failure became tragically clear. His leadership, once defined by its tactical brilliance and ruthless ambition, was now a pale shadow of its former self. The rival Khanates, sensing weakness, slowly chipped away at his authority, like vultures circling a dying animal. The territories that had once bowed to him in fear and respect began to openly question his legitimacy. The soldiers who had once marched proudly under his command were now scattered and demoralized, their loyalty to a fading leader dissolving into disarray and chaos. For Janibeg, there was no path to redemption. His empire, ravaged by both plague and profound disunity, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The Golden Horde, once an unstoppable force that had terrorized half the world, had fractured into a collection of smaller, weaker Khanates that would never again unite under a single, powerful ruler. His reputation, which had been forged in the fires of brutality and conquest, was now a twisted tale of hubris and unmitigated disaster. Despite his desperate attempts to rally the tattered remnants of his army, Janibeg could not reverse the tide. He could not restore the strength of his broken empire. The Mongol world, fractured and weakened by bitter internal strife, was now dangerously vulnerable to outside threats. The once great leader, who had inherited the fierce and formidable legacy of Genghis Khan himself, found himself fighting a losing battle not just against his human enemies, but against the invisible, relentless plague he had foolishly unleashed upon the world. In the year 1357, Janibeg died. He passed away, not as a glorious conqueror, but as a broken ruler presiding over a shattered empire. His death marked the final, somber chapter in the downfall of the Golden Horde. His legacy, forever stained by the disastrous siege of Kafa and the horrors that followed, would never be one of triumph. Instead, it became a grim and enduring warning, a lesson in the terrible perils of unchecked ambition, the unforeseen dangers of biological warfare, and the catastrophic consequences of attempting to play God. Janibeg's death marked the end of an era, but the legacy of his catastrophic decisions would continue to haunt the world for centuries. His attempt to use biological warfare during the siege of Kafa had not only decimated his own forces, but had also triggered one of the most devastating pandemics in all of human history. The Black Death spread like wildfire across continents, ultimately killing an estimated 200 million people and fundamentally reshaping the course of civilization. The Mongol Empire, once an unstoppable force under the legendary Genghis Khan, would never recover from the losses incurred during Janibeg's ruinous reign. The Golden Horde, which had been the most powerful of the Mongol Khanates, fragmented into smaller, weaker states that warred amongst themselves. The plague had crippled the Mongols' ability to maintain control over their vast territories, and the bitter internal strife that followed only further weakened their hold on power. But the true cost of Janibeg's decision went far beyond the fall of a single empire. The use of disease as a weapon had irrevocably changed the nature of warfare forever. It was a terrifying turning point in military history, a moment when human ingenuity was twisted and used to unleash chaos on a truly global scale. And while Janibeg's actions were horrifyingly unprecedented at the time, they set a dangerous and dark precedent. Throughout history, others would attempt to wield biological warfare as a tool of conquest, from poisoning wells to distributing infected blankets, leaving a long and tragic legacy of suffering and destruction in their wake. In the centuries that followed, historians would look back at Janibeg's reign with a mixture of awe and horror. His undeniable military genius was completely overshadowed by his recklessness. His towering ambition was eclipsed by his profound lack of foresight. The Mongol Empire, once a powerful symbol of strength and unity, had been brought to its knees by one man's burning desire for revenge and a single, catastrophic decision that spiraled horrifically out of control. Janibeg's story serves as a chilling reminder that even the greatest of empires, the most powerful of rulers, can be undone by a single mistake. The consequences of his actions, both for his own empire and for the entire world, were far-reaching and completely irreversible. The fall of the Golden Horde, the apocalyptic spread of the plague, and the enduring, terrifying impact of biological warfare on history are all bound to the same tragic moment, the fateful decision to turn a city into a weapon. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most pivotal moments in history. We'll see you in the next one.